So next slide, let's look at leadership in the church here a little bit. But diakonos, presbyteros, and episkopai are all Greek words. And Pastor John preached about these a few weeks back. But a few things here. The apostles are focused on founding the church. They are witnesses of Christ, bearers of the truth, and sources of authority. And we see them in Acts operating in a pretty collegial and consensus-based way. There is some deference to Peter and Paul and James the Just as particularly important figures in that, but there is no hierarchy of authority. And apostles, the sent out ones, and we see that after about AD 50, 15 or 20 years, less than 20 years after the resurrection, we see them going forth in every direction. West across the Roman Empire and east through Parthia and on to India and north around the Black Sea to the Scythians and into Armenia and south into Africa and west towards the Atlantic. These are the places that the apostles went. They went in every direction carrying this truth as founders of the church. It's interesting, Judas Iscariot, having done what he did, is replaced in Acts chapter 1 by Matthias. Within 20 years, 15, maybe less, James the Greater, James the brother of John, the sons of thunder, is executed by Herod Antipas. And he's not replaced. There's no discussion of replacing him. Judas is replaced only because he turned from the apostolic role, not because we just keep adding people. There's no replacement for James the Greater. There's no replacement for any of the other apostles. So it is not a continuing role. It's not some hereditary role. These are founders of the church and initial members of the gospel. But the apostles is a role, a function that is confined to the first century. There is no attempt on the part of the apostles for them to appoint others to succeed them in that role. They see that role as being a one-time thing that occurs in the first century in the founding of the church. Now, one of the things that we see, of course, is that by the 5th century, even in some cases by the 4th century, you've got churches at least all across the Roman Empire and into the East jockeying to prove that they have an apostolic connection, that the church in this place was founded by one of the apostles, that there's an apostolic connection to how the church came to this place. And so you begin to see in the late 4th century, and particularly by the 5th century, you've got churches that are working really hard to establish that, this apostle visited here, or we are heirs to that apostle, and to make that connection, because there's this strong concern that we need to be able to show that we are part of, that we are an outgrowth of the first century church. And that's the connection. That one of the 12, Paul, Barnabas, Silas, somebody, if we have a connection to that, it shows that we are part of this church. We have the things that we believe as a church in this place are from the apostles themselves. They're based on that eyewitness testimony. So that's the apostles. We get deacons and elders out of Acts chapter 6 to begin with. But in Acts chapter 14, in the latter part, Paul and Barnabas' first missionary journey, they go back through the cities, Lystra and Derbe and Iconium, Antioch of Pisidia, and they appoint elders in every place. Titus 1:5, Paul tells Titus, go back through Crete, and in every town and city where there is a congregation, appoint elders as leaders. Philippians 1:1. Paul is writing to the church at Philippi, and he writes to the overseers and deacons in the church. 1 Peter 1:1, Peter talks about how he's writing to the elders of the church in particular. And Peter says he's writing to them, later in that letter, he says he's writing to them as elders. So we see two very different responsibilities in Acts chapter 6, the ministry of the word and prayer, and works of service and mercy. And we see from that the sense that those who are called to either of these roles should be men who are worthy of respect, men of some gravity and dignity. So when we think about elders, presbyteros, the connection is to, the Greek word connects to an Old Testament term that comes from the Hebrew, which means the bearded one. In the 21st century church in this country, we have a lot of people, a lot of young fellas who are like, you got to grow a beard in the church. And one of the reasons you got to grow a beard in the church, you see, beard has been a symbol for 2 millennia or more being a mature man and ready to lead in the church. So for those of us that have a hard time growing a beard that is not laughable, this is a little bit of a challenge. But anyway, but thinking back to the Old Testament and to what elders did there, elders were about preserving and nurturing life under the covenant. And they had both a civil and spiritual role in the Old Testament, the Old Testament being primarily about a theocratic Israel. But in the New Testament, the civil role is removed. They're not elders of the community, they're just elders of the church. Okay? And in the Old Testament, they were elders of the tribe, of the community, and elders of the church at the same time. And so the role is more defined in the New Testament. And how old do you have to be one? Well, there's the bit about the beard. But there's also, Joseph became the prime minister, the second in command of Egypt, about the time he turned 30. David became the king about the time he turned 30. Levites served in the temple from age 30. Jesus began his public ministry around the time that he turned 30. So there may be something about that. We don't have a specific age limit, but if you're looking for a guide, that's a place to begin. Presbyteros in the New Testament, 1 Timothy 5:17, preside over or rule the local assembly, and some of those who are presbyteros will focus on preaching and teaching. But presiding over and ruling the local assembly is a core function. Titus 1:6, presbyteros will be blameless, the husband of one wife. In Acts chapter 20, verse 17, Paul calls the presbyteros of Ephesus. And then in verse 28 of that same passage, when he speaks to them personally, he addresses them as the episcopi, the overseers. 1 Peter 5:1, as a fellow presbyteros, I'm speaking to you, not as an apostle, but as a fellow presbyteros, and a witness to the truth. You are called to be witnesses to the truth and shepherds of the flock. But he is making this calling as a peer, not as an apostle, not as the Pope. So 1 Peter 5:3, Peter warns presbyteros about abuse, overstepping, lording it over to others. It reminds us that this is a call to service. And so insofar as there is a consistency about the use of this word presbyteros, this term, it is almost always about, with a core function about leading. And leading the community, leading the church. The diakonos, of course, the deacons, servants, waiting on tables is actually the deep source of the word, diakonos. So when it says in Acts chapter 6, we should not be waiting on tables. That's actually a direct play on the source of the word diakonos. So deacons are supposed to be those who feed and serve those in need. They provide some table service, as it were. That is, they provide individual service to people in need in the church. And individual service that is targeted on their particular needs. That's the call of deacons, to each as they require. So 1 Timothy chapter 3, it makes the argument that deacons must be tested and approved before they serve. So episcopi, and in the New Testament, Paul seems to use presbyteros and episcopi basically interchangeably. That might not be true in Titus. In Titus, in Titus, it seems like he's using presbyteros about leadership and episcopi about kind of shepherding and teaching, and so that he's making some difference there. But that does not seem to be true at all in 1 Timothy or elsewhere. So Peter always uses presbyteros. He doesn't use the word episcopi at all. So there's not a clear distinction here, and people for many years used those two terms basically interchangeable. But presbyteros, elder, and episcopi, overseer. And so overseer certainly implies a key element of shepherding. The word episkopos actually comes from a Greek term for an inspector. And the way that we get it really into the Bible is that the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, those who did that translation used this word as a shepherding leader. So in 1 Timothy chapter 3, this is the word that is used throughout that passage. And so the call to be able to teach, not just motivated to do so, but able, effective in doing so, and not a novice, a warning about people who should have some depth and maturity and preparation. Titus chapter 1, the episkopos is about being God's steward, somebody who is appointed and accountable. And then about a focus on doctrinal fidelity, holding fast to the truth as taught, refuting opponents, teaching the sound doctrinal truth. And so in the second half of Paul's speech to the elders of Ephesus, he shifts to this term overseer, episkopos. So there does seem to be potentially some core function here about sound doctrine that's associated with this. But this became fairly soon the growth into a regional authority on the truth, on the core functions of Scriptures. The presbyteros became the role that you saw in the local church of leading and guiding and shepherding, and the episkopos became the person that a group of presbyteros, when they gathered together, appointed as their head or their leader, but the person that they looked to as the deep expert in the Scripture, in the truth. So there wasn't any real difference in their terms or their use. At the beginning of the church, there was no hierarchy here, but there was an evolving sense that there were two roles, the actual leadership of the local congregation and the focus on the truth, keeping the truth, understanding the truth, refuting those who taught doctrine that was false. And we see, Romans chapter 12 and 1 Corinthians chapter 12, there are lists of gifts, and in both of those, ruling and exhorting are separate. And so separate gifts. And so we see today and down through the church that there is some sense that ruling, leading, running the church, shepherding the people, and preaching and teaching are different functions. And so this has helped to strengthen the idea that there are elders who lead and rule and operate the church, and there are elders who preach and teach. And that these are not entirely separate functions, that there's overlap here, but that anyone who serves as the elder of the church will probably emphasize one of these two functions. And, the modern Presbyterian church talks about ruling elders and teaching elders as an outgrowth of that idea. And we're heir to the idea that, of this pool of elders, some are pastors. And so preaching and teaching is a core function for them. It is worth noting that there is no New Testament basis for the term pastor, and there is no New Testament basis for the use of the term priest in our conception of the church. Hebrews talks about Jesus as our great high priest, but Hebrews makes the case that he has fulfilled that role. And we don't still need that. So when we use the terms pastor and priest, we're putting something on the New Testament rather than pulling something out of it. And that's an important takeaway. So anyway, so those are a few things about leadership from the very beginning of the church.